So our form is coming on quite nicely. However, we do not have the capability to actually submit it yet. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this. One is using the submit event. The other is using the Angular style ng-submit. And this just simply prevents default for us. So it's quite a good idea for us to then use ng-submit instead of using just a direct submit event. If we want to use submit, it's absolutely fine. I would encourage you to use ng-submit instead. So we're going to call this the handle submit function. So let's first go and add our handle submit, and then we'll talk about some arguments that we can pass down into it. Now we do not need this ng on init, so I'm going to simply remove it. We can then add our handle submit. Now because we are implementing on init inside of here, we can go and clean this up from our component and our imports. So we're left with something like this. One thing I like to do is just clean up any generated code. There doesn't tend to be a lot, but it's quite a nice thing to do. Instead of leaving small trails of breadcrumbs, which then add up to things that we then have to mentally think about. So when there's less to think about, in my view, that's far better code. So our handle submit. How do we get this object and then essentially pass it off to another component? So what is the flow here before we start thinking about it? We want the user to fill out our form, press submit. We then need to take this object definition when everything is valid. Now, because we're in a DOM component, we're not actually going to be communicating with a service directly. We're going to, using our donut single, we're going to pass an event up from our donut form into our donut single component. Now, because this is a smart container component that simply contains our donut form, this component is then in charge of talking to the service. Remember, it's handing off these more complex tasks to our DOM components. So how do we get that value, our form value here? Now, the easiest way to do this, if we jump up to the top, we have our handle submit, but we also have this ng-form, which we're then exporting as hash form. So why don't we just pass this all in? Now, this is going to give us an underline because it says expected 0 arguments, but got 1. So what this essentially means is our handle submit function, if we jump down to it, is not expecting any arguments. Whereas if we now type it as form and then import the type of ng-form, if we hit enter, this is then going to import our ng-form definition. And all this is a class. So we can use a class for our type definitions. And you can see here that it's got those properties that we used. We've got our form, we've got our ng-submit, which we're then using. We've got some options that we can pass in, some validators, lots more complex stuff that we don't really need to know about just yet. We also have this control container. So what this essentially means, if we command click on the control container, is we have name, get form directive, which doesn't really appear to be a big class in itself, but we're now diving deep into the Angular type definitions, which also come along with the source code. So if we now jump from our ng-form all the way down to the last item that's inherited is this abstract control directive. So here we've got value. So where we are accessing in our donut form, down at the bottom inside our pre, we're doing form.value. Now this is an inherited property from our abstract control directive, which is made up of this class. Now if we have a look, we have things that we've already covered: valid, invalid, pending, disabled, enabled, errors. So this is exactly why I've then taken you through these. Now if we keep going, we're going to see more useful things that we can look forward to learning about in the future. But essentially I wanted to show you this for now because this ng-form object inherits so many different properties that we can then grab some information from. So in our case, we want to grab the form value. So if we just simply say form.value, so this is then going to log out our form value in the same way up here we are logging it out in the DOM. So what we need to now do as the last step is add a button with a type of submit. This is then going to allow us to submit the form nicely. And because we are then creating a definition, we're going to add the text of create. Inside of our style.sass, I've already created a class name called button, shortened to BTN. If you go and open it, we then have our button definitions. We have gray, green, and I've added some hover and disabled. Now for this one, we're going to use button -- and then green. So when we save this out, we then get a nice create button. So then when we go ahead and inspect element, we can then bring up our DevTools console. So we can say testing, choose a random icon. We can set the price to 100. On the promo, we'll select new, and we can just say some text here, ... Click create. This is then fired our submit event because our button initiates that on submit. And we then have the object that we then see down below. We have name testing, icon just chocolate. And if we break this out, you can see that our price is not a string as it would be in plain HTML and JavaScript. So Angular is then parsing this over to a number quite nicely for us. So the next step for this would be to provide some validation, because we can, of course, submit this button even if our form is invalid. There's nothing stopping the user going ahead and start clicking things. As you can see, we have these empty strings for all of our object properties. This lesson, of course, is talking about that submit event. We've talked about the submit on its own. We've talked about ng-submit and how it does that event prevent default like we would use in plain JavaScript with something like add event listener. Now, the reason that we want to do this is because we want to stop events bubbling up the DOM. And that is a DOM event. An Angular event will allow us to then bind to when we then start wanting to send this information upwards. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next few videos. So with this in mind, we have bound a submit event. We've created our handle submit. We've talked about our ng form, which has then been passed into our handle submit function. Down in the body of our class, we've then created this handle submit, which just at the moment logs out our form value. And there is a reason that I'm not passing just the value down in the DOM up here, because we're going to use a method, which is quite a nice user experience feature that we can add in a few lines of code as well. So I'm excited to show you this. Let's dive into the next lesson and get started with finishing off our submissions.